Yeah.
Irungu, what are some of the drivers of this act that essentially would change some of these factors that Faith brings up? What is in the act, essentially?
Yeah. So the act, which I have to say is quite it's quite a unique act in the sense that it was passed, it was assented. I think, as Faith has said, immediately there was resistance to it. Right. So over the 2010s, there was a period between 2000 and I think 2014, particularly to 2017, where the state tried to amend the NGO Coordination Act and refused to bring in the PBO Act for like 4 to 5 years. 900 non-governmental organizations were arbitrarily deregistered, including some of the most well-known human rights organizations like the Kenya Human Rights Commission. You saw attempts to try and shift funding from the sector. Like 85% of the funding that would come into the sector by law through this amendment was destined to head back to the state. And it's only because governance and human rights organizations and health organizations, if I remember, particularly fought back against this act. So it's within that context that I think the PBO Act needs to be looked at. There are a number of important developments. One is, for example, around the idea that public benefits organizations, and the term is quite a simple one, is that any institution that produces public benefits or benefits for the public is a public benefits organization. So if you think about the raft of organizations, you've got trusts and foundations, you've got community-based organizations, you've got a whole range of international and national non-governmental organizations. All of that now fall within the public benefits organizations framework. So the first thing is that it's created a singular framework for all these institutions, first of all, to provide services. And in this context, advocacy is a service, right? I mean, this is the other thing I think that's exciting about the Act. But the other point about it is that if you're receiving public funding, either from individuals or from governments, you have a higher level of integrity and a level of obligation to manage that money well. I remember back in 1994 with the now she's on the Supreme Court, Joking Dungu. We arbitrated between an NGO of directors, and the executive director had decided that it was a good idea for the NGO to be paying rent to one of his properties, of course, right? And the board was up in an uproar. There was a massive breakdown, and we actually had to mediate and explain that it is not acceptable for public money to go into private hands, even if you're the executive director, particularly because you're the executive director. So I think the conflict of interest principles within the PBO Act are really important. The second one is it's framed within the freedom of association. And this idea that Article 36 says that everybody has the right to associate, and that association is independent of political patronage. And maybe the last one that I would probably bring in is that the processes of registration, whether it be the name or the organization itself or the management of the organization or the dissolution of the organization, that cannot be subject to arbitrary decisions by state administrators. It has to be subject to the right to be heard, the right to reply, and even there is now within this act that wasn't there before a tribunal. So you can actually within 30 days request for an independent assessment of whether an action that's being taken against you should be taken against you. And I think that these are the core functions of the Act. The other one I think that's important, particularly in this era now, and we've just, as Amnesty International, published our human rights report. One of the things we found there was that international funding for non-governmental organizations has begun to shrink dramatically. So you're talking about shrinking civil space. The more dangerous thing is shrinking funding. And there what the PBO Act does is it creates at least two channels of funding for this sector. The first is an international solidarity. So it creates a framework for international donors, philanthropic organizations, individuals to contribute. But the other thing it does is it allows and begins to start a very important conversation that Kenyans need to have, which is that, much of the work that civil society organizations do must be funded by Kenyans first and foremost, because that builds the accountability, it builds the predictability of the funding, and that's why this act is so important, because there's a whole schedule that talks about support for people who want to give to the sector as opposed to only giving in the form of taxes. Now the question is, the law is great, implementation is the most